Hello, this is Will Faber from Art to Ride, and today we're looking at a first submission by Pia of her horse Fiona. She's had Fiona about 2 years, she says, and in that time she's had a bit of soundness problems and back problems with the horse. She's a 3-day event rider who wants to ultimately event this horse. And this is just the beginning of her lunging work. And we're going to see the horse over a period of time here, and we're going to see huge improvements in it between now and the end. So the first thing I'll say, you're very much on the right track. This horse is coming beautifully by the end of this, as we will see. Now here in the beginning, you can see the horse is rather stiff in the back, doesn't really want to stretch all the way down. And we see that the hind legs are they're very, very short strided. You can see that there's almost no flexion in the hocks at all. We can still see, even though the horse's head and neck has come out this far, there's really no push through the back. The horse is really just still pulling itself along by its front legs. It gets a little better as the horse begins to stretch here, but nowhere nearly as good as you ultimately get it to. So you are very much on track. And then we're going to take a look at some cross-country fences later on. What you should know about me is that I was one of the top event trainers in California for many, many years, trained many California state champions, and many people that went back east from here to event. Was where I started my career in Unionville, Pennsylvania. So I'm very familiar with eventing. And it's been a very upsetting time, for us old eventers to see what's been happening in eventing, because the same thing that's happening in eventing is happening in the jumping world. That is, people are getting by on the jumping talent of these fabulous horses today without training them correctly. And unfortunately, it is leading to a lot of deaths. We just had another one just about a week ago or so. There was another jumper girl who was killed a week or so before that, all because of rotational falls, which we'll talk about. Rotational falls mean the horse flips over on you and lands on you, and that's when you get seriously mangled for life or even killed. So it's why it's so important that we impress upon people the importance of jumping style, the horse jumping through its back, and the difference in the safety and how people are being taught. And when we get to your jumping pictures, we'll talk a little bit about that. But you've got a ways to go to get your seat in the middle of the saddle and to release correctly, so you're not holding back on the horse when you jump, because that's what leads to falls. If the horse can't right itself, it starts to trip and fall. If you don't let go of its mouth, it will fall over on top of you, which is what's causing all these horses, all these accidents that are causing so much damage to so many people and horses, of course. So the biggest thing when you're lunging here that I see all the time, and it does get better as you go on here, is that you want to try to get the horse to yield his hindquarters a little more to you. As you can see going around the circle here, we see how the shoulders are pulled slightly outside. So what you want to do is get the horse a little closer to you at first, and even doing the work in hand work. If you haven't tried that, I would highly recommend you begin work with that, because that's where we can really improve the lunging, by doing the work in hand first and teach the horse to move out away from the whip, and then we find that it's much easier when we get to that phase of riding the horse in the same exercises, or lunging them, as the case may be here. So we want to move those hindquarters away from you a little more. Our goal should always be to at least have both ends of the horse tracking on the same circle. And then if we're good at this, we can begin to ask the horse for a little shoulder in on the circle by asking the whole hindquarters to yield a little bit further away from you. Which, once again, when it does that, the point of the shoulder in, the horse steps deeper under the body with its inside hind leg and tends to push off of that leg a little more, which pushes the back up and pushes the neck out in front of you, which is really the whole trick to the whole thing. So shoulder in is really the foundation of all good dressage work, if you want to look at it that way, even if it's just shoulder in on the lunge line. Now here the horse starts to stretch a little better, and he's starting to move a little better. Now look at the flexion in the hocks here. This is much better than what we saw just a moment ago in the other direction. So we can see the horse is now actually starting to push a little bit with the hind legs. And once again, the stride can only complete itself if the horse's back is round. Otherwise, as you'll see, if you watch so many upper level horses today, for instance, when they piaffe and passage, the hips actually go higher than the forehand, which is the actual opposite of what we're trying to achieve, of course. So this is a much better, more active trot. And of course, as you talked about before, if you had saddle problems, you're beginning to realize the importance of a good fitting saddle, but just how much damage a bad fitting saddle can do, and how important it is to get a horse over its back to keep them from getting sore in the back. I mean, a lot of times it's not entirely the saddle, but once again, if you just ride a horse hollow for long enough, its back will get sore, I guarantee you. It's like all the horses that have kissing spine today, which has become really an epidemic because of so much bad riding. Well, this trot's looking a lot more active here, a little more swinging, as we said before, and he's a little more on the circle in this direction. The hindquarters aren't quite so much. Watch as he comes around here. You see how the shoulders are still a little bit outside, especially right there as he comes around. So just want to keep working on getting the hindquarters to the outside a little more, and that will get your stretch a lot faster when you do that. And of course, that's our goal. We want to spend as little time with the horse moving badly as we possibly can. So even if that means just walking for a long time. So the rule is always trot for a while, but if you can't get it there, then you want to come back to the walk. Get it to where you can succeed each day of getting the horse over its back, even if that's only in the walk. Because even if you only do it in the walk, in time, it'll get over its back in the trot and then over its back in the canter. But now this neck is starting to stretch much more forward. Now here's where you could ask the horse to just work a little more actively. He's starting to kind of slow down a little bit, and I think you could be a little more active in asking him to become more active himself, pushing those hindquarters away. And look how the neck begins to stretch there. That's looking so much better. And watch the back end of the horse. And as the horse goes down, we should see more action in the hocks. That is, it should be lifting those hind legs up, and we should be seeing more thrust off the ground, which we're just beginning to see here. But right there is where you want to just send the horse a little bit more actively forward. And remember what I'm saying, forward always means to engage forward under the body, not just to run forward in a direction. So I just feel like in this section right here, you could just be asking for a little bit more, and I think you get a little more swing through, and also by virtue of pushing the hindquarters out, you get a little deeper stretch. But compared to what we saw in the first direction, that was really good and a big improvement. Now this horse is pretty nicely in flesh, so to speak. It doesn't look like it's skin and bones, but we can see when he stops there is a dip there in the back, and we can see how the neck immediately becomes U-necked again when he stops stretching, because that's really where the muscle is at this moment. So our rule is always that, if you can't keep the horse over its back in whatever you're doing, you shouldn't be doing it, so to speak, or you shouldn't be doing much of it unless it has the goal of getting the horse over the back, or just testing it to see if that's there. In other words, if you walk the horse for a long time, get it swinging, we start the trot. And if we don't get the horse into the stretch in a fairly short time, a few minutes at least, then we just go back to the walk and get the horse swinging in the walk again. Now, of course, that applies to everything else that we're doing, which would also come around to your cross-country jumping. If the horse isn't working over its back, you certainly don't want to be cross-country jumping on it, because you're putting yourself in harm's way by doing so. And I can tell you from the jumps I saw at the pictures here, which we'll look at when we get there, the horse is not jumping over its back nearly enough. Yes, it's kind of stretching its neck out over the fences, but it's not jumping through its back enough. And you're way too far ahead of the motion, but we'll get to that when we see those pictures. Not a bad canter here, but not one I do a lot of. Still isn't really stretching into the contact much, but it's not terrible. It's not so disunited that I would say don't do it at all. But I would say only do it for short periods of time and get the horse back into the stretch again. Remember, our goal is to get the horse stretching in all three gaits. But that wasn't bad there, and about the right time, a few circles around. But we can see that even after the canter, he came back even a little more hollow, then he didn't really come back and stretch deeper. And you can see here now when he's not stretching how clearly the back end is kind of falling out behind. We don't have that as good a flexion. We can kind of see the horse pulling with the shoulders a little bit there. So you can see how short and stabby those front steps are. That's why they're like that, because the horse is pulling itself mostly more than it's pushing itself. I'd like to see you try to work more consistently on a circle rather than moving around the ring so much, or at least at times stand still. You can see here when you do how the hindquarters once again are inside the circle, so getting them to push those out would be what you'd want to do. And I think you could do that a little more actively than you're doing here. And once again, as the horse comes back into the stretch, we see how the underside of the neck begins to relax. There's a little longer stride, though that's getting a little slow right there again. And you see how as the energy kind of drops away and the horse stops moving and swinging, you can immediately see how the back begins to drop and the hind legs start falling out behind. So also remember once again, no matter how old the horse is, it takes about 2 years for the horse to go through the period of pulling the shoulders up through the withers, which is what the stretch does. And then the horse can come up into full collection, because remember, collection is dependent on the horse being round in the back. If the horse is not round in the back, you cannot do actual collection. That is, the horse won't lift, the thrust won't lift the horse into the ground, up in the air. So we see hollow-backed horses, that's why they're all just moving their legs. They're pulling their legs up rather than propelling themselves off of the ground from their hind legs up into the air, which is what real collection is. It was very interesting, once again, this last Olympics, how much better the dressage of the three-day event riders were than of the actual dressage riders, which is very telling about where dressage has gone to today, because once again, correct dressage is how you train a jumping horse. But can you imagine going down to a fence with some of these dressage horses that we see today with their chins pinned to their chest and broken over in the third vertebra and completely hollow? Well, you'd have a very hard time making it to the other side of the fence riding like that, because the horse's energy, just like a saddlebred, it's all being wasted by pulling its legs up in the air. It's not propelling you anywhere. And if it weren't for the fact of how damaging it is to the horse, I would say, fine, well, that's all great. If you want to just ride around a little ring where there's no variance in the footing and this sort of thing, ride it however you want. But the problem with all of these hollow styles of riding is the horses who suffer for them. The riders do eventually, too, and the horses flip on them and that sort of thing, but it's the horse that sort of starts suffering on day one of that type of training, of forcing it into a false frame. Well, we can see that this horse has become quite swinging and active. It's getting better here as we go on, and we'll see this horse progresses to the end. It really gets to a good place. Now, were it I wouldn't even bother to ride the horse till I got it to the place where you get to at the end of this tape. Though I know people can be, we all, we have these horses, we spend a lot of money, we want to go riding. It's hard for people to go, okay, well, I'm going to have to stay off my horse for months at a time while I begin to strengthen enough. But the good news is if you do that work correctly, the horse will now go on and last you for 20 years, where if you don't do that work, you'll be buying another horse in a couple of years because this one will be worn out. And we start to get the stretch a little better. And of course, our goal ultimately is to be able to do all this without anything on the horse, which she does by the end of this tape. So we get to a really good place by the end of this. Same thing here with the canter. It's pretty hollow. Not so terrible that I'd say don't do any of it, but I wouldn't do much of it. She's not quite really over the back enough yet. Now, Pia was talking about in her letter to me how the horse, she feels this different impulsion cross-country than you do in the stadium round, that she has trouble maintaining impulsion. Of course, that's very normal. So that means that, when you're going cross-country, you're just going off the horse's natural nerve and a little bit of excitement by going a little bit faster. But that doesn't mean that you should. This is what leads to falls. So what tells me if the horse comes back and in the ring, you can't get the horse to jump with the same enthusiasm. It tells me right off the bat there what's been going on, that the horse isn't really trained, that it's just, it gets out in the cross country and it's a good-natured horse and tends to go more naturally and gets a little bit of excitement, so to speak. But we don't want a horse to be excited. That's what leads to so many accidents. We saw one at the last Olympic Games where a man came very close to being killed on a rotational fall over a cross-country jump. And you could see him coming down to the jump, pulling the horse back and pulling the horse back and pulling the horse back. And, of course, what ends up happening, he lands the feet through the top of the oxer. And, of course, it's a solid fence, and over the horse goes and just misses landing on him by a few inches. So remember, those rotational falls are the worst thing that can ever happen to you. That's where most people with horses get killed, has been rotational falls. So now we see with some time has gone, obviously it's summer now, we see the leaves on the trees, so we can see some time has gone by, but how much better this horse is already starting to lunge here from the time you started there. Now we're getting the stretch a lot deeper. The biggest thing here is I'd like to see you, as I was talking about in the other ones, you still need to just try to get the horse a little more active and still need to push the hindquarters away from you a little more. If you watch swimming around the circle there, you'll see once again how the hindquarters are inside. So while the stretch is good here, now we need to activate it a little more and get a little more swing through. Remember, stretching down only facilitates the back coming through. It doesn't mean that it's going to be coming through. We see Western riders all the time who ride this peanut rolling style, as we say, where the noses are on the ground, and that's what a lot of people confuse what we're doing. What we're doing has nothing to do with that. That's just putting a horse's nose on the ground and leaving them there and never asking them for anything else. But once we get them there, the idea is that that's what allows the back to swing through. So the goal is not to stretch down. The goal is to get the horse to come through the back and lift its back up and allow the thrust to complete itself through the horse's back. So once we get the stretch, then we start to have for a little more swing. But we can even see here how the horse is already, even though it's a little slower than I'd like it to be, you're not what I call the optimum stride. Optimal stride, you need to just ask the horse to come through just a little bit more, be a little more active. Once again, the hindquarters need to yield a little bit away from you. But at the same time, we see what a huge improvement this is over the previous videos of this horse lunging that we saw. This is getting much better. It just needs a little more active swing. Now another thing, and also where jumping starts, where jumping should start is with a pole on the ground. So it might be a good idea for this one, I do it quite often with my horses, just put a single pole on the ground with a couple of guide poles out to the front, in other words, like a big T, so you have something guiding the horse into the pole, so to speak, a little bit, or winging it a little bit, as you might say. But just a simple pole on the ground is a great exercise. Once you get the horse stretching to this point, I wouldn't do it till I got to this point, but then you can start just actively trying to get the horse to swing a little more actively, and then you can put a single pole on the ground, which helps them pick up their legs a little bit. So remember, jumping starts, in the immortal words of the great Jacques Le Goff, who was the head of the Cadre Noir in France and was the great 3-day event coach. That was our coach in America. The only time that we've really done really well as a 3-day event riders was when we had him as a coach. That is, our whole team overall did really well. We, of course, has had a lot of individuals, but ever since then, we haven't really had a coach the way that, you know, he was the coach, in the sense that in the old days how it worked. It wasn't just a point system where, like it is today. That's what ended up happening, and how part of the denigration of what's happened is that we no longer have a coach that picks the team. It's simply a numbers game. Whoever wins the most, in other words, whoever spends the most money going to horse shows, which has fallen right into the hands of the greedy horse show corporate people, it falls right into their hands. And that, you know, now it's all about just going to as many horse shows as you can possibly go to rack up the numbers. But it's also what's destroying so many horses, because people are in this number thing, and there's always somebody who has the money to go to every single horse show and rack up point after point after point, which is kind of the point of when this woman sued the AHSA. She felt like she should have gotten on the Olympic team because she had more points than anybody else. But unfortunately, that changed everything, and now that's all there is. We just have a point system that guides who wins everything and who gets these slots at the Olympic Games. And if you can't afford to send horses all over the world at a huge expense, there's no way you're going to get in there. Which is why I personally think, at least under the rules that they are now, I think that all of the equestrian sports should be taken out of the Olympic Games. People will have umbrage with me for saying that, but it's no longer a fair sport, in that it's just a sport of whoever can buy up the best horses in the world gets to go. So that's not really an amateur sport any longer. Pretty good canter here, and much better canter and much more swinging than what we saw in the earlier ones. So just some things to think about while we think about moving forward with all of these sports. How do we rein this in? You know, one of the problems is we started going way too much for spectators and worrying about whether spectators were enjoying it. Well, there's not many spectators for horse events, at least in America anyway, so why bother? Let's keep it safe for the horses and riders rather than trying to create something that's more and more spectacular so people can go and watch the falls. That's not what it should be about. Unfortunately, it's become that. Now look how much more flexion in the hock. Now this horse is starting to really reach. Now this is the first, what I would call close to optimal trot that we've seen. And once again, we're at I. Now, of course, I've been doing this for a long time, and I get them there rather quickly. But the point is, this is when you'd want to start riding a horse, when you actually get it to this point where it's really stretching into the contact on the lunge line and getting quite consistent. You know, this would be the point at which I would start doing more riding with the horse. Not that I might not have gotten on it at all, which I do all the time just to test the waters. But if they're not there, if there's no water to swim in, so to speak, that is, if there's no backup to ride, then I'm just going to get off and continue doing the groundwork. But this is actually transformed, and we can actually even see with this horse now, it looks like the back is a little flatter behind the withers there. Of course, we can see it better without the saddle, but even to me, it looks like it's come up a little bit. The stretch is so much deeper. There's a lot less muscling on the underside of the horse's neck now, and it seems much more happy in the work. Now the same things still apply here, can still move his hindquarters a little bit further to the outside, but this is really getting good, and this is the first time that we've seen the horse really getting into what I would call a working trot in a stretch. That is, the horse is working over its back. Remember, of course, that's why they called it a working trot in dressage tests, was to differentiate it from just somebody trotting around on a hollow horse. But unfortunately, so many of the judges today don't seem to understand that, or don't even seem to understand what working gaits are. Beautiful trot right there. Now you can really see the horse beginning to complete the stride through the back. So that's infinitely better than what we saw. And now I'd say, this horse is getting to the point where now I would say it's ready to begin riding and schooling more than what you've been doing. He looks like a really sweet boy. Pia here is in Denmark, I believe. Beautiful country. Maybe next year we'll be able to get to Denmark. If not, be sure and come to one of our clinics. We'll be pretty near you. We will be over there a couple of different months. We'll be there in May, and I think we go back in August again. And once again, look how the horse is going right into that stretch. And that's the key to take away too, is look how relaxed this horse is getting, how much happier in the work, and that's kind of the point of it. As Bill Steinkraus said, it's never going to be good if you can't get the horse, and it's never going to be safe if you can't get the horse to like it. If the horse isn't trying for you, if the horse is constantly looking for a way out of what you're doing, it's just a matter of time before it puts a foot wrong, and you have a fall or some other problem where the horse just goes lame. But when they don't want to move, there's always a reason for it. The nature of a healthy horse is to move and want to move. And want to move freely. So when they don't, it's usually a pretty good sign that something is going wrong. And of course, that something can be many different things. It could be bad shoeing. It can be barefoot shoeing from taking a horse that had shoes on, taking them off and getting them sore. A bad fitting saddle, an out of balance rider, all of these things can create these problems. So we have to eliminate them one by one when we come to a horse that we're trying to work with that isn't over its back. So really good work here. I think you've done a really good job bringing this horse along, and now, as I said, it looks beginning like it's ready to do something. And getting back to our jumping issue, jumping starts with a pole on the ground. As Jack Legoff said, jumping is just dressage with fences in the way. So there isn't any difference in how we train the horses. We just start jumping them over things when they're ready to do so and over their backs. Now this is getting so much better here. This literally looks like a transformed horse from the first video that we saw. So you've come a long way in this short period of time to get much closer to where you need to be. So the rule in correct riding is once the horse is over its back, we can go over a pole on the ground. We can go over a pole on the ground, then we can go over a set of poles on the ground, that is in cavaletti, and once we can go through all those, staying stretched. A lot of people take horses through poles and they feel this phony kind of passage feel, and they think that it's something. That's just the horse hollowing. So just like everything else, going over cavaletti are good for your horse if the horse is over its back. If it's not and its head is way up in the air, you stand a very good chance of laming the horse. I've seen at least 5 or 6 horses in my life break coffin bones because they were hollow and people were trying to take them over poles, and they step on a pole and break a coffin bone. Also, the jumping technique that a lot of people were using for many years of putting a pole in between jumps to try to slow the horse down instead of learning how to ride. But once again, so many horses landed on those poles and broke coffin bones or pulled ankles or whatever the case may be. So it's never a good idea to even ride a horse that's not over his back because it's not safe. I've seen horses fall down with people just walking around a ring with people. And somebody does something wrong, they get their legs crossed over and the person hangs onto the bridle and down the horse goes. But look how beautiful this is getting to be here. So once again, you could add just a little more swing to this. Like right there is getting really optimal. Right there, that's just so good. So now, in my opinion, you'd be ready to start working this horse under saddle and trying to get the same thing. So that's our goal. You can still see there's a bit of a dip in the horse's back as it comes around there. But what you'll see over the next year or so is that will totally go away and fill up. So now we're going to see some jumping pictures, which I'm going to just quickly comment on. But you can see this horse, you're holding on much too much. You're way ahead of the horse's motion. You've got too much contact with your hand. You're not releasing forward enough. And here we see a totally hollow jump. You're back more where you'd like to be in that jump. But same thing here, you're way ahead of the jump. You've got too much contact in your hands. He's way over jumping the jumps, which is not something you want to do either, because that's unsafe. And see, once again, you're way ahead of the horse here. So those are the things we need to talk about. The Will Faerber from Art to Ride. Look forward to seeing your next submission.